everyone. Welcome to the STOA, the last session of Stephen Jenkinson's Philosopher in Residence series at the STOA. And the prompt for the series was Stephen's new book, A Generation's Worth, a Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns, which you can purchase on the Orphan Wisdom website. And the first session of the series was based on the first chapter, Die Wise. The second session was based on the second chapter, Matrimony. And the last session will be based on either the last two chapters. Chapter 3 is Money and Soul, and chapter 4 is called Come of Age. So we'll start with Money and Soul, and perhaps we'll get to the last chapter as well. So how the session will work, if you have any questions anytime, put it in the chat. I'll call on you and you can ask your question to Stephen. If you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So I'll start with the first question, which will be about money. And for those of you who don't know, Stephen actually wrote, I think it was his very first book or one of his first book, The Money and the Soul's Desire. Here's a hard copy of it. I haven't read it yet, but a lot of the themes seem to be similar to the third chapter. And I guess on the surface, it might seem odd to many that someone who's in the death trade and often speaks about death and dying has a book out there on money. So the first question is a basic one. Why has money been a preoccupation for you?
Money has not been an occupation, God knows. So I'm only left with preoccupation as its status in my life. I did okay for a while in the death trade, only because I was a public service employee. No, it was by accident entirely, as many of the major themes of one's life tend to be. And it was, you know what? Thank you for the prompt. Why not a little trip down memory lane here? I'll give you a taste of it. And I'm doing something. Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. As to how it came to be in the first place, if I can find it quickly. I do remember it. Well, I'll have to. The good news is here, I'm under no strain to keep everybody scintillated and entertained, right, while I'm looking for this. Everybody's capable of that on their own, no?
We're a bunch of Stoics here, so we can, you know.
Sure. You can wait with the best of them, right?
Right.
Okay. Very good. Well, you know, that's what ceremony is. It's 9/10 waiting. And if you can wait well, then the 1/10 is this pushover. I can't honestly find it. So, and I just underlined it for this very reason, not 20 minutes ago. That's the problem with underlining. You do that instead of remembering. The gist of it is this. I was in a marriage that was imbalanced money-wise, which is to say that I followed the ludicrous aphorism that one should stick to what one's good at in matters of the heart, at least, if not elsewhere. And so I had no encounters with money as a kid to speak of. You know, we grew up fairly moderately. And then I married into just a shitload of money preoccupations and a mercantile family and all the rest, which I didn't really know at the time, but I came to be on the receiving end of the fact that well-off people are simply a different kind of people because their universe is a different universe. And that's true, all except for the birthing and the dying part. Otherwise, it's pretty much unrecognizable to us mere mortals. And I stuck to what I was good at, whatever that was, I can't recall. And my wife at the time stuck to what she was good at. So she managed all the money. 7 years down the road, what happens? You have a circumstance where trading on your ability has impaired you, and everything else that was not your ability becomes your disability, not surprisingly. 7 years down the road, you cultivate a capacity for kind of grudge and grievance and a sense of being excluded from the mainstream of the the matrimony's finances and so on. Even though you engineered the arrangement, 7 years later, you don't even remember that. You just remember a feeling of being on the outside looking in, and somehow you fantasized that it wasn't your call. So this is obviously a tender trap that is that's bound, that, you know, doom belongs in the equation. So the relationship never had a chance ultimately. And on the PS, the things had more or less come unglued, the great undoing, as I call it. And a friend of mine came to visit in those trying times when I was inhabiting the matrimonial house on my own, pending the dissolution of the whole thing. And he said to me, you know, you should think about how money screwed things up. And it came to me completely out of the blue. It should have been the first thing I thought of. But that's not how wisdom works, right? Wisdom is basically the last thing you think of. And I was offended, you know, as any good Anglo-Saxon would be. And it was very distasteful, the idea that somehow money, the kind of slovenly, groveling life, was somehow could account for the great downfall that I was in the midst of entertaining. And so I thought about it. And I ended up in $1 a month office, hunting and pecking because I couldn't really type at the time. And I tried to remember every story in the marriage where money was a factor, which is to say almost every story of the marriage. And I just wrote them down. And basically I was trying to survive the sorrow. And as I did so, a kind of connective tissue began to enunciate itself between the stories, you know, including my naivete, I should say. And man, you want a blistering encounter with a less discovered part of yourself, your naivete will stand in for a lot of other things. And so you could say that writing the book completed my downfall. And that's how Money in the Soul's desires began to happen. And I was as shocked by the outcome as anybody was. And, you know, to this day, I look back at the book, having written 3 others or 4 now, and it's slight as a book goes, as my books have gone. And I feel that I didn't do anything I took on justice. I did, on the other hand, fess up. So as a first outing, I mean, I'll have to take that, you know. And then the PS on that is, I remain troubled by the title. I originally called it Automatic Teller, which I thought was very clever. Those were the days, I mean, nobody can remember it now, but the great leap forward in banking was to not meet another human being. And many of these things were drive-ins at the time, and they were called automatic tellers. I don't know if the term even still persists. So I thought, yeah, the book, yeah, that's what, the subject itself is an automatic teller of the one's inner terrain, usually involuntarily. But the brain trust at the publisher didn't go for it. And so it became Money in the Soul's Desires, which was the original subtitle. And I'm still chagrined at the use of the word soul. And I'll tell you why. To my mind, the language that we have in English available to us to articulate the topography of the inner life is one long synonym. That's basically what's happened, except in certain rarefied circles, and this may be one. But generally speaking, on the street, you can't distinguish in common use soul from spirit, from psyche, maybe from mind, but that's not easy, from self, from spirit, you know, and on and on. And of course, virtually none of these words come to us from the Anglo-Saxon world. They come to us from the Mediterranean, and they're loner words. And any loner word that persists over a long period of time tends to tell you an etymological story that goes like this. Apparently, your people's people needed these words because they had none, which is to say, they probably didn't have a glossary that contributed to the neuromancy of the inner life. And so they borrowed all these words upon domination by the Catholic Church and other things. And you can tell to this day, we still haven't cultivated our way beyond the early pagan days in this regard. And we just basically use these words like this. And I'm afraid that's what I did in the title. I didn't really articulate what I meant by soul beyond suggesting that it didn't have substance nearly as much as it had a tendency and meaning and territory. So there's the quick answer. Necessity, in other words, necessity was the brunt force trauma of my self encounter in those days.
Mm-hmm. I'm being asked a lot to have more sessions on money, on the nature of money. And there's something in the air where there's lots of people, probably the majority of people, that are naive about money. And, you know, you can say there's a negative aspect to this, but perhaps the positive aspects is people are deeply questioning what money is. Like, what is money? Like, you know, like the foundationally. And it leads to really weird rabbit holes when you start asking that. And so I'm curious, with the process that you went through with your previous marriage and this, what seems like an alchemic process of writing the book, any lessons to impart on the nature of money and how to be in a relationship with it?
Sure. I'll begin with a story. I was on a live phone-in talk show on the television some years, shortly after the book came out. And I was seated beside a guy. I won't name the family. A lot of people will have heard of the family for the reasons that'll become clear. But he was the third son. And typically the third son, the scion of the family, tends to be the one who mops up after the other two sons when there's a great deal of money in the family. In other words, his job was to implement the family's charitable trust. In other words, he was supposed to dispense money instead of making it. That's the booby prize in a rich family. That might sound like a gross generalization, but it has served me well over the years as I've observed it. So I was sitting beside him, and he was a very sophisticated man. He was rather taken with the fact that I'd been to Harvard, so he was willing to give me the time of day briefly. And somewhere in there, he acknowledged that when he said to me, well, as you know, he said, money is the root of all evil. Now, of course, he was trading on this, right? He wasn't really inviting me to wonder about it. He was invoking this kind of old horse, this old beat up, ill-considered proposition, as if since it sounds biblical, it must be biblical. And if it's biblical, it's older than dirt. And so it must be true and all the rest. And of course, it's a faithful rendering of the misgivings that you were alluding to in your question. Money is the root of all evil. And I said to him, well, actually, you know, it's a common enough error. So you certainly can be forgiven if you didn't bone up in your Bible before you came into the show. But that's not actually what it says. What it says is, for I tell you, brethren, it is the love of money which is the root of all evil. Which is to say, even the Bible gets it right sometimes. And in this case, they got it devilishly right. They were pointing not to money at all. They weren't taking the easy way out of demonizing money. They were articulating that the real conundra are to be found in how we come to it, in our wild and extravagant associations with it, in our failure to consider and reconsider all of those things. But I said, but never mind all of that. Here's what I'm really wondering. If money indeed is the root of all evil, and you're very persuaded about it, why are you handing out money every day? And everybody in the studio stopped dead, because it was very clear that no one had thought this thought on the matter of charity. If indeed money is the source of all of our troubles, the last thing we should be doing is spreading it around. So he had no response, poor fellow. And I'm not sure that I do, except to say that one of the things that you could learn historically is that, money came up early in the history of the West, extremely early, actually. And one of the ways you can track this back is that you investigate. I'm going to see if I can come up with 3 or 4 off the top of my head, a number of words, and I ask you whether they come from the inner life trade or from the financial trade. Forgiveness, a bond, grace period, debt, trespass. Okay, that's the best I can do on short notice. Now, all of these things are something you can engage in a bank, or you can engage in them in the privacy of your own mind or soul, or in a place of worship. So what's up with that? That's a good thing to wonder about. Why do we have virtual cross-contamination linguistically between these two things, which we imagine probably historically have been at odds with each other so implacably that we can't make peace with the two of them inside our own life? Such that when I was working in the stone carving trade, I routinely came across artists who demonized money people routinely, particularly their agents or their managers or their patrons, demonized them. And it wasn't surprising to come across money people who minimized or what's the word I need? Trivialized people in the arts communities for their naivety in money matters. And around it goes. Okay, so I'm going to suggest to you that something very, very historically relevant and available to us is up. And I think I can find this one quickly. Okay, here we go. If you're looking for it later, it's on page 166 in a little chapterette that's called Too Much God. The history of numeracy and then of literacy in Mesopotamia, which is where we get ours from, turns out to be bound closely to the advent of agricultural surplus, trade in that surplus, and commerce with strangers. Numeracy developed to keep track of volume, the magnitude of which began to beggar memory. And literacy developed to keep track of who owed what to whom. It did not develop to celebrate the poetic genius of humans, nor to worship the gods, but to indemnify them instead. The principal grain warehouses wherein literacy probably developed were in the ceremonial precincts, in the temple compounds under the aegis of the priestly hierarchy. Why? Because this arrangement is a holdover from an old understanding that was by then in eclipse. And it's this: surplus was once known to be the stuff of the god or the goddess themselves, their very bodies, their very being, and the priests were God's minders. A surplus of divinity in the world? Unthinkable. Surplus means what? It means I don't need it now. It isn't extra, it is excessive. Surplus in an animistic culture is transgressive. You don't trade in God in a real culture. You can trade in what God gave you. That the trafficking in surplus ended up superintended by the religious hierarchy. That religious hierarchy took their technical language from traffickers. And that seems like a foregone conclusion once you consider these things. If I asked you without warning, what came first in the early days of what became the West? God language or trade language? As likely as not, you would say God language came first. Even if you weren't sure what I meant by the phrase, you'd likely answer that way. Why? Because it stands to reason that spiritual practice preceded business practice. And because it is more seemly, more in the fashion of the priorities of the soul, first the holy, then the commercial, we hope that at least it started that way before it all went to hell. In the advent of literacy, we can see that business record language seems to have come first, and it was imported into devotional record language. Why? Because there was no language in the devotional precinct for this trespass. Let me say that again. Why did business language come first and was imported into devotional or spiritual language? Because there was no language in the devotional precinct for the trespass of surplus. Because there was once no such trespass. The priestly assumption of the commercial language was an attempt to speak the unspeakable. By the time literacy appears on the carved stelae, it is being used to tally the wages of trespass and misdoing and calamitous accident that the trespasser owes to the complainant. And it's given over to the tracking of debt, trespass, sin, recompense, that whole complex. It's used to codify indemnity and to standardize the economy of transgression. By which I'm saying, maybe that wasn't that easy to follow. It was a rather crash course in the West, abrupt and coarse, I'll grant you. But the suggestion I'm making here is this. I did a lot of work when I was teaching the Orphan Wisdom School on the history of the advent of literacy. And one of the things that really came clear in the Western version of it, the one that comes from Mesopotamia, is that the earliest records are business accounts. They are not prayers. They're not supplications. They're not anything that we might have imagined them to be. That's not where it came from. The impulse to record beyond what you could recall is fundamentally a commercial enterprise. So the question becomes, how did commercial language become so available and ultimately seemingly necessary or indistinguishable from devotional language? My answer would be the advent of surplus of all things. And here's why I think it's a thing, as they say now. So imagine that principally the Mesopotamia was a grain generating place, which it was. So in the earliest iteration of the enterprise, the grain was God or a goddess. The grain did not represent, symbolize, or in any other way indicate God. The grain itself was God, him or her or them very selves. When the advent of surplus occurred, it was a consequence of the incoming of the Iron Age by virtue of the sickle and a few other things. Surplus was the unthinkable thought for an animist. These were animistic cultures in their origins. And when I call it an unthinkable thought, I mean that an animist is not capable of viewing a certain portion of the made world and entertaining the possibility that it is not alive and not in possession of all the attributes of alivedness that the viewer is in possession of. And surplus begins the long, tired, tragic road towards inanimism, where only a few things in the world are alive and the rest of them have never been, right? And the way that happens in surplus is that you have to overcome the residual ancestral memory of animism and the reluctance to trade in God. So you lay up what you do not need. And that laying up of what you do not need, your bounty, your excess, becomes a sign of God's favor instead of the presence of God. So now you can trade in God's favor and you don't have to contend with the unthinkable thought that you're trading in God. Never mind a portion of God that you, for the moment, do not need, that you can store instead. I have not read this in any book anywhere, but I'm proposing, because we got nothing else to talk about on a Friday, that's a fairly big deal in the West. And so that's my thumbnail sketch of what may have come to pass.
Mm. Wow.
Yikes.
What's coming up is the relationship with this, maybe the love of surplus, mammonism, love of money or lust of money, how that's related to the death anxiety that our culture currently has.
Well, I didn't know you were going there with the question. I was with you until the last turn, but let me get there. First of all, the disequilibrium which money seems to induce in the moral universe of most normally reflective humans shouldn't surprise us if we're willing to consider the fundamental nature of money first. Now I'll get to death in a minute. My suggestion here is this. As I said in the Money and the Soul's Desires book, money is principally alluded to in integers of its resemblance to liquids of all things. It's rarely referred to as anything solid or substantial or enduring or prevailing. It's quite amazing that way. It's never thought of in terms of rock solid, mountainous, part of the terrain. The language of its liquidity and therefore its volatility is, first and foremost, generally in the quick associations we make with it. So it is, as Jung said, mercurial, right? There's another liquid illusion. And its liquidity means the unlikeliness of it obeying you is high, right? So if you think about your associations with the ocean, though you may not have had much experience with the ocean, but you may admire it from a distance, but being in it for a long period of time, the first time can be border on the undoing for a landlubber. Why? Because there is no particular place to be when you're in the ocean. There is no locus. There's no topos. So you just take the understanding of being essentially a stranger, adrift in a strange land, and then imagine it in your encounters with money. And I'm reminded of a piece of advertising I saw years ago. It's a heinous piece of advertising. And it goes like this. There was a father who was trying to figure out his income taxes at year end, right? So this is probably, what's that infernal operation called? Who'll do your tax for you on the street corner? That doesn't matter. Anyway, I think it's from them. So, and what happens is the kid who's 4 or 5 years old starts responding to his father with all of the acronyms, RSPs and and they're just flying out of his mouth. And it's very clear that the kid, quote unquote, understands this terrain much more than the father does at 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And the tagline in the advertising is, you do the living, we'll do the math. What does it tell you? It tells you what Antonio Machado tried to tell us in a very short poem years ago. He said, mankind owns 4 things that are useless at sea: rudder, oars, a sail, and the fear of going down. They're consequential, but it's not clear that they're useful. So, apropos of the dying then, dying has, I think, this sense of dark midnight liquidity about it as well. It's very insubstantial. It somehow looms. It doesn't dilute. It is the diluter, you could say. In other words, when you contemplate your own death without a lot of, I would say, disciplined inquiry on the matter, you're likely to begin thrashing at some point in the proceedings. And that thrashing, I'm suggesting to you, is a consequence of feeling that the oncomingness of your death somehow doesn't distill your life's inclinations. It dilutes them to the verge of meaninglessness, insignificance, unenduringness. that even your dying will last longer than you will. This kind of thing. Fundamentally, these things are mysterious. And the best encounter with mystery is the one where the mystery deepens as a result of the encounter. But you're under no obligation to suffer mystery. I mean, the suffering upon mystery is a consequence of the insistence upon fixity, no? And the unwillingness to be mystified. And the beautiful thing about dying, not unlike matters of high finance, is that you can be mystified in the most ordinary of encounters. You don't need a peak experience of these matters. You just need to be, the door of your inner life is ajar and can't quite close properly once you glimpse the irrefutability of your ending, the non-negotiable, bigger than you prospect called your finitude. How are we doing?
Good. Let's get some other voices in here. If you have any question, just put in the chat or raise your hand. Jessica, I'll take you in.
Thank you. Stephen, I'm wondering if you could speak to reparations for historical transgressions and what, like, money maybe isn't the currency of that, and what is a currency of reparation?
I wouldn't be persuaded out of hand that money is not becoming of serving as a medium of reparation in the circumstance you describe. I think the desire, the instinct to set it aside as deeply unbecoming or worse, or as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. This is a kind of unexamined moral puritanism that goes all the way back to those Mesopotamian priests that I was talking about. I'm fairly sure that this is true. It's such an enduring prejudice, and it's so highly reflexive that it operates under the radar of your choices when it comes in. So, like this. And yet, I should tell you a story that came to me some few years ago now. I may exaggerate the proportion in the telling of the story, but the spirit of it is the way it came to me. I don't know if we talked about this in a previous session, but it bears repeating. So we came to the attention of the world in the last couple of months as a consequence of the discovery of unmarked graves at residential school out west, right? Okay. And we have a lot to answer for when we go traveling and putting our Canadian flag on our backpack, and properly so. Okay, so years ago, these things were certainly available to be known. Residential school, as a fact of Canadian life, was more than available. And the ludicrous response of much of the Canadian public that they simply didn't know is a kind of Nuremberg plea to me. That's what it is. It's just unthinkable. You don't get to hide behind you didn't know. You're a citizen. You avail yourself of the upside of the citizenship of this country. You have a vested moral obligation to know the unauthorized story of this place. Full stop. Okay, but that's not the story this is. So residential school survivors, not my favorite word to characterize these people, but it's a common one and they seem to use it, so I'll go along with it. Endured God only knows what in the manner of as they matured and as they went through their life phases and they tried to establish families and tried to establish an ongoing social life. And, given the odds, I mean, anyway. So all of that, they lived through it all, not all of them, but they lived through they lived through the doing and the undoing of it. And then the Canadian government, not that many years ago, because it's under the younger Trudeau's reign, decided it was time to fess up. Properly so, a little late, but okay. And so they made you probably remember this, a formal apology. An apology or confession requires two things, right? It requires an acknowledgement of trespass. It does not invoke the inevitability of forgiveness. It requires the acknowledgement of trespass, and it has to be done aloud. The Catholics really got something right with that dynamic when they made the confessional. And so he did all of this. And I am told by people I know in a few indigenous communities that upon the creation of a fund to recompense them for their lost childhoods, which is at one level unthinkable and deeply inadequate, at another level, it is part of the world we live in. And there's something to be said for the move. But upon that, and upon the receipt of the official apology and all of that, that former residential school inmates or survivors began to suicide in record numbers, in heretofore unseen numbers. So what's going on there, do we suppose? My suggestion would be this. There was something in the overt confession of the government that was hard to bear. But the most unbearable of it all was the obligation to turn up for work or for one's ordinary life the morning after. There was something about the ordinary life that couldn't reabsorb the radioactive arousal that ensued from the confession and from the establishment of the fund and from all of that. So I understand that to indicate something like this. The remarkable thing about the willingness to consider money matters in the context that you're asking me about is that money is in one instance, so exceedingly ordinary and banal and mundane that you can't think of anything more formless, pointless in and of itself, fundamentally worthless as an object today. I mean, it's not even carbon and it's silicon, I suppose. It is not even paper. And at the same time, its capacity to exercise our meaning-making part of ourselves is not to be disowned because we're troubled by the meaning that we generate from it. It's to be owned, not in the sense of propriety, but in the sense of responsibility. So this is why I was going to call the book Automatic Teller, because with money, you can see yourself in action in a way you can't with philosophy. If you're doing money, there's a nakedness to your doing, which may not become initially available to you, but is there with some real discipline, which other undertakings give you the chance to sidestep. So the nakedness and the fundamental substance-free quality of money is a void that we fill with our associations. And so we can watch ourselves in action. And it's enormously valuable and important as a presence in our lives by virtue of that function.
Any follow-up thoughts or shares, Jessica?
Well, yeah, thank you for all of that. And I guess I'm also, when you're talking about the nakedness of the function that we can see with money, and I think there's the side pieces that when money is offered. I know, I can't remember exactly how long ago this was, but in Saskatchewan, there was some financial reparations made maybe 15 years ago to Indigenous people. But it seemed to be, a preventative kind of thing to indemnify the government against future losses, and tied to some kind of silencing, non-disclosure agreements are in other kinds of, and so I think from what you're saying, I feel the value of money in the reparation process, and also that it can't be a silencing agent. It has to also be just part of the process. So thank you for that.
I understand what you mean, and it's a good point. And I would respond by saying to you, by virtue of its quixotic function and presence, it is not a silencing agent. Because the action of trying to silence people with money becomes palpable and obtainable to the rest of us when that kind of action is undertaken. It wouldn't be the same if it was in kind, if it was land, for example. You see? But it's money. And as soon as it's money, where's it coming from? Who's doing the paying? The government is acting on whose behalf? Where did they collect the money from to turn it into gag money, if that's indeed what it was, which it sounds like? And that begins the process of examining the entire enterprise and the role that money plays in it. So it's never, although money in and of itself seems silent, it's never really silencing. Because the act of applying it topically becomes a discernible thing. With discipline, I'm saying. So what you got to do, I mean, at the risk of sounding like I'm suggesting something to you, what you got to try to imagine doing is developing the discipline where you routinely observe yourself in the act of reactivity when it comes to money. Rather than adjudicating the merits of the behavior in question, you observe yourself in the act of reacting to those behaviors in others. Right? And I think there's more of the soul's gold in that discipline than in the capacity to call out the bad guys. As important as that might be, but I think the other one has at least equal value. And watching ourselves involuntarily become disgusted and demeaning of the enterprise and all of that. And then you wonder about, is it natural or naturally occurring a substance as it seems to be when it rises in us? And fundamentally, it's a prejudice. It is not wisdom. It's a prejudice. And it's easy to come by. And it's immensely challenging to see. And it earns its keep virtually every day.
Thank you, Jessica. Zach, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for this. And this is maybe even going back to last week's conversation around matrimony, and it's something that came up for me then, but I didn't bring up, and so I'm trying to bridge it all together now. But that role of the third between two people or two souls, is there something to what you're describing here about money and what it represents and how it fills that space, and what a marriage and matrimony and patrimony create in between two people that can become its undoing? And even going back to your biblical comments from before, there's that biblical concept of the two becoming one flesh, which is different than the two focusing on a third in the middle. And I feel like in my experience in church and trying to be biblical in other ways, that there was a pressure and encouragement to put God in the center of your marriage. So that would be the third. So right. If you can discern a question out of that, I'll let you go. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I think you found a very, in a very agile way, an employable concern there. So I'll take the last part first, the thing about the two and the one and all that, and the third, without getting too systematically theological for the moment. I just say that the notion of two becoming one, that one didn't exist before, but the primordial ones did, right? So the notion is that there was one and there was two, and when they become one, that's the third. So that's one of the mysteries of the Trinity, right? That you don't see three anymore. You see a one that didn't exist. Where there was once two, that's the third. So it does work. Even at the level of strange mathematics, it works. Money and intimacy, at least in the West, is a strange brew, isn't it? It's not a welcome admixture. And so what's the prenup all about? Is to micromanage. Now, allegedly, it's to enable people to be free to love each other, minus the malfeasance of those kinds of calculations, or keeping one foot out in case things go south and at least you got yours, right? You don't need a lot of money there to keep one foot out. That's called ambivalence. You don't need a prenuptial agreement to articulate your ambivalence. Unfortunately, in a dishonest way, you're employing it to make as if there now is no ambivalence because you're sorted, at the level of your money. No, but I mean, and the sanest among us will say, just not a healthy way to begin. Just no matter what you say about it, no matter what the lawyers say about it, the chances of your matrimony overcoming your prenuptial agreement is very remote. Because sooner or later, somebody's going to say, yeah, you were always planning this, or words to that effect. So you're getting ready for, with your parachute and all of that. I think matrimony's principal architecture is ceremonial. This is why I isolated the moment of matrimony from the ongoingness of marriage, right? It's a discrete moment that's characterized not by promises or promissory notes, as I think I referred to it last time, but characterized by vows. And vows are volatile propositions because they're incarnations, right? The word, of course, means enfleshments. They're invocations, putting to voice something. And those were the days where people actually believed there was consequence to saying something. And in fact, from a Latin point of view, that's what the word fate actually meant for the longest time. It didn't mean the fix was in. Fate literally meant what the gods said. That's the active verb. The gods spoke, the world became as a result of their speaking, you see? And now the challenge for a cognizant human being is, how shall you carry yourself? Now that the gods have spoken in the form of gravity and physics and chemistry and givenness and weather and the incontrovertibles of life, how shall you be? What shall you say? How shall your humanity appear amongst us? That's the challenge of fate. So it comes really as no surprise to me today that the collapsible tent of fate has collapsed entirely in our time and turned into another version of the word fatal. See, there's nothing to be done. That's what fate is. That's what's the way fate is used now. And I think matrimony, misunderstanding what fate is, tends to come to it as a given, an affirmation. I mean, modern matrimony. People come to matrimony as if it was an affirmation of something that already exists. And I was at pains, I think, last time to try to point out, then you don't need a ceremony. You just need the party. So forego the ceremony altogether. Don't bother yourself with it, coming up with strange words and repeat after me's and all of that. Just go directly to the wine and the cake and the questionable chicken dinner and all that, and call yourself done. And you can get away with it. How? Because you've said all along, you were already married in every way but legally. That's what I mean by it's an alleged affirmation of something that's already happened. But in any kind of understanding of matrimony as a ceremonial undertaking, as an incarnation, as an invocation, it's calling into being something that did not exist before, that you cannot conjure on your own, not even the two of you. And the attempt to do so, the French have a term for it, which I'm not going to slay by mispronunciation, but the gist of it is the madness of two, which is a psychiatric term in the statistical manual for mental disorders that psychiatrists use every day. That's what modern hooking up is. It's a madness of two that basically excludes the world. And the radicalness of a matrimonial ceremony is it brings the world to bear upon the feelings two people have for each other. It makes the following claim: the world must benefit from you joining. That's the throwdown of matrimony. The world has to bear the upside of your finding each other and your alleged happiness. I'm not sure I really made the link too well with money, but I did pretty good on the matrimony thing just there.
Yeah, man, you had a couple of bombs in there that I'm still kind of reeling from. I'm gonna have to watch this video when it goes live.
You should try being me thinking this stuff. I'm glad this is the last one. I don't never have to do this again.
Hey, you're not done yet. We got another 33 minutes with you. So I noticed Lori had a question that was building off of mine, and maybe Peter's going to kick it to him next. But there's a word that you used early on, reckoning. And I can't remember if you had tied that to that same sort of kind of business commerce language as well. But I wonder if it aligns with Lori's question as well. So that's sort of my thank you and alley-oop to that next question.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You want to jump in, Lori?
Yeah, sure. So it's about your experience really that you've spoken about in the first session of this residency around sort of death and dying and relating some of today's thinking on money back to that. So what have you found people's reflections on money to be when they're confronting death, if any? And you know, just thinking about some of the things we hear about, you know, you can't take it with you, death comes to everyone regardless of wealth. But at the end of life, does our relationship with money kind of remain intact, or does it change? What's your experience been?
Sadly, there's nothing inevitably. I'll say it differently. There is an alchemical aspect to dying, but the alchemy is not necessarily dissolving of or transforming of the life habits that you bring to bear upon or at that time. I think I must have said somewhere in the early going there that in my take on things, people tended to die in the manner of their living. That sounds like a very innocuous kind of armchair observation until you see it. And I promise you this, if you're an inquiring person and you see a fellow human being cling for dear life to their ordinary life, to all the banal trivialities of their ordinary life, as they're being invited to be upturned by the enormity of their dying, you will mourn after their poverty beyond your capacity to do so. It will be so undoing to you as a witness that you'll find it becomes a kind of unthinkable travesty that's happening right in front of you that there's no one to blame for. It's at that level of travesty that there's no culprit. There are only practitioners. And it's enormously sad making. So I never saw dying sort people out. Now, did people, let's say, take the opportunity to finally be undone in a way they could never have managed when they were healthy? Yes. So that I'm characterizing it in a way I deem to be very important. Their health, their maximum, efficacy, their peak income generating years, all of that stuff availed them not at all when it came to the fundamental exercise of being undone, unwoven, disassembled. See, nothing of your there is a kind of shocking invitation that's unbidden, that's very sudden, that basically whispers to you, honey, there's such a thing as too late, and you're flirting with it now. So at the level of the banal story, I heard this story. There was a palliative care nurse in Australia, I heard tell of. And what she would do is keep kind of a straw poll. I don't know if you're familiar with the term, a kind of informal survey that she did with every dying person she worked with over, I don't know how many years. And she found a way to ask them all the same question. And she would record the answer. And after a while, the answers she could tend to be able to codify them because they weren't wildly diverse. And the answer, and the question was, what do you regret? Or what do you regret most? Something like that. And the answer that came in was like by integers of, I don't know how many, more numerous than the second leading answer. It was that much more. And the answer was, the biggest regret was that they worked too hard, or they worked too much. That's what it was. That banal, they worked too much. And I think you can translate this in two ways apropos of our discussion today. One, the nature of the understanding of work in the West, right? Which is to say, probably they mean the stuff they were least inclined to do, that they were obliged to do by necessity or habit or both of them. And too much meant they imagined that they were distracted by this working life from the real thing, from the important things. So it's a terrible visitation at the end of one's life to realize that too late has only begun to occur to you now, when in actual fact, you were flirting with too late for literally for decades, right? And you were waiting for calamity to do your dirty work for you, which is to say, rather than coming to a kind of involuntary but volatile decision about what being here is for, and submitting all of your life habits to the excruciating scrutiny of your demise, you clung to them instead. That's what you did when everything was going well, and you waited for something horrible to come to course correct you, to bring you to your senses. And what you were able to do with virtually every calamity that came your way was turn it into another opportunity to work too much. So the habits of the human psyche are remarkably agile and seem to resist almost anything until the last days. And then the last days come, and your inclination to think in grim terms about yourself reaches its apogee, which is more habit, you see. And then you ask yourself, as I do, culturally speaking, not individually, culturally speaking, what's it going to take? What kind of calamity or crisis is necessary, where more or less collectively we look up from our busyness and say, whoa, this is going to stop. Be prepared to stop has become be prepared to be stopped. And that's surely where it sits now. What does it take? My answer is simply this. Collectively in the West, we have two problems. Only two? Well, there's others, but these two I'm thinking of. Number one, we have a climate change crisis that's demonstrable, non-negotiable, ongoing, and accelerating. That's problem one. Why can't we fix it? Because the technology, the understanding, virtually everything is there to do so. Here comes the second problem. The reason we can't fix it is we have a second problem. It's called the rights of the individual in the West. And as long as the rights of the individual, bearing in mind certain curtailments of the law, are held in such high esteem, then the rights of the earth will come second, and they are, and we cling to our second problem to thwart us in the solution of the first. We're under no individual obligation to change the world, save the planet, or get sane anytime soon. And that's what the last 20 months, I think, has shown us. It's simply not bad enough. And this might sound extremely dark as a sort of parenthetical take on contemporary Western culture, but it is both unsustainable and unsustaining. And so we ought not to be surprised that in the moment of our individual demise, the life that we were the beneficiaries of proves to be its unsustaining qualities come forward beyond its capacity to convert us to life. That's its power, but it doesn't happen. It rarely happens. And so that became my job, to advocate for a kind of character annihilation of a kind. That's what the work unto dying, that's how I would have characterized it at the time. That you have no obligation to continue to be that self that you've learned how to be. You have no obligation to be another self. You do have an obligation to rid yourself of your selfness. Since it seems to have done you no good, I could go on and on here. Let me stop, because there's probably other people that want to get in.
Do you have any follow-up thoughts or shares, Laurie?
No, just thank you for that. I'll be marinating on that for a while, I think. And hopefully it won't be one of the things that I recall at the end when I was told explicitly that it will probably be when things are too late that you realize things are too late.
Right. Yeah. Too late is that's grown-up food. Okay. Transformation. Too late. That's your transformation. You see, you can come to an understanding of too late now, in advance of the visitation of too lateness. You see, it's available to you minus the facticity of it. It's extraordinarily generous when you think of it that way. In that sense, it's very much like you're dying. You don't have to be dying to be willing to know its unalterable qualities and to govern yourself accordingly and to sub-friggin mit, as I would say.
Alan, you had a thought or share?
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
So I'm struck by, behind this love of money, which we all dance with, there's a deep love of self, and the love of money is a way to avoid looking at the self. And your earlier comment about, taking the time to observe our own response in financial transactions and what arises within us struck me. But this whole cultural engagement and personal engagement with using money to avoid really deconstructing the self. So not really a question, I suppose, but.
Yeah. Well, I would invite you to consider this possibility, that people at least as frequently employ the lack of money to do so. So it's not the presence of money per se, I don't think, that has the consequence of you bailing on your responsibilities of self-knowledge. I think it's the unwillingness to be tutored in money's alchemy. And one of the great baptisms that the West has developed is that kind of, like, you may be a flesh-loving creature in all of your life, but mysteriously when it comes to money, you're an ascetic on a mountaintop sitting in the snow naked, right? You know what I mean by this? In other words, you take certain vows, don't you, of cleanliness and all the rest. And that's the Puritanism I was referring to in an earlier response to what someone had said. Puritanism, of course, is only laughable to people who've never encountered it. Puritanism is no joke. It's not like, making fun of people putting dresses on the bottoms of tables so you can't see the legs. That's not Puritanism. But one of the things you're alluding to, there's Puritanism. It's diabolically puritanical to imagine that money causes you to do anything. Now, I know there's people listening who are saying, wait a second. There's the question of economics and economic inequalities and all of these things. You're saying these don't have consequence. I'm not saying that at all. There's a wide range of things that we could address here, but what we're addressing for the moment in your question is the inclination of individuals, the mythical individual that we're thinking of, to employ money as a kind of paper dragon, if you will, to keep certain disagreeable things at arm's length, including one's own self, right? And then ultimately every moneyed person becomes an exemplar of what you should never be, what you should never do, and the rest. There's a high degree of intolerance in this kind of puritanical disinclination where money is concerned. So the reason I started at the beginning by fessing up a little bit and saying, well, here's what I did in that first marriage. I did everything I did nothing I was no good at, including the money thing. And what did it produce? Did it produce a kind of in-house democracy of capability and inclination and responsibility and the rest? Hell no, it did virtually the reverse. It made two citadels of expertise across which nothing passed. And she was really good at it, and I was no good at it. And writing a book saying you're no good at it doesn't make you any better at it. I can promise you that. Because the habits remain, don't they? So writing a book is not an act of absolution at all. Anyway, it's a good response. So good what you're thinking about.
Any follow-up share, thought, or question, Alan? You're on mute.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I do want to share another thought that I've had a number of times over these sessions. There's a Zen teacher, Hakuin, who told his students, die once while you're young, and you won't have to die when you're old. Uh-huh. I've had that thought a number of times listening to you talk about working.
Right. Well, there's a kind of Semitic equivalent that the first family I was born into used to say with some frequency before I was in the death trade. They would say, as a gesture of kind of strange futility, that kind of strange Jewish resignation, defiance complex, if I could call it that, which I observed as an Anglo-Saxon, I observed as an outsider, and one of them would say to the other, or to me, apropos of worrying, I think, look, if you're going to die once. Something similar, no? So, I mean, I take the invitation to re-examine your care and burdenness over care. Yes, absolutely. But I don't think that the entertainment of your demise is really a recipe for being carefree. I don't think that's what it nor should it, actually. I think it's there for you to engage as fully as is conceivable the moral and ethical obligations of your citizenship. Honestly, I think your finalities are what you owe your greatest allegiance to, understanding that the act of translating what it means is your life's work. Because it's not a given. Oh, I've seen my death, and therefore I'll be okay now. No, there's no capacity to be okay. And don't forget, even if you are okay as a result of seeing it, you're probably surrounded by lunatics. So good luck with being okay. You see? So what you really want to do with your encounter with your finitude is to do everything possible to democratize the death wisdom that's come to you, such that you get a chance to die either flailing or contemplative in the presence of some death sanity, which you're not solely responsible for, because if you are, it'll die with you. And the achievements here are nothing to brag about. Yeah. Hence, we're doing this.
Thank you, Alan. So we're approaching the end of the session, and we mostly spoke about money and soul today, but chapter 4, Come of Age, Meditations from the World Tree Withered. I don't have any particular question on it, but I was wondering if you wanted to share anything on that last chapter, or perhaps read a passage from it to close us off.
Well, I hope I won't close you off by virtue of us coming to an end, but I take your point. Let me see. I will read something. How much time we got? 10 minutes or so, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. This is something I wrote on the 9th of March of this year, and it's called Long in the Tooth. So what lasts? Grudges, they last. Slights last, even glancing ones. Sorrows, they find their feet and they trudge on. In the north of the hemisphere, I will tell you this, cold lasts. A good song can last, though it needs some good singing to do so. Wanting things to last, that lasts longer than those things do. Hard times seem to last, though it's not clear that they do. A list of what lasts, it doesn't last. Love, well, that's another book. We try, we mean well, at its best, at its most persistent. It lasts as long as the lover does, or the beloved does, or both. But for the rest of us mortals, love is notorious for being overwhelming and then underwhelming, until sometimes there's no whelming at all. A plague lasts a long time, being the biblically proportioned thing that it is. Memories of a time before the plague, they haunt and they whisper and they crowd the mind, but the plague sees to it that they don't last. A lot of things have ended without fanfare during the course of this pandemic, and they're not coming back. How about the wisdom of the ages? It has the reputation of lasting a good long while. Well, the idea of it seems to last, but there isn't much consensus on what's in the wisdom of the ages. The Tao Te Ching seems to have lasted, though there's those pesky questions of translating those lofty but general proposals for the daily grind. The Bible's been around for a good long while in various forms, though its reputation as a guide through the fog and the frailties of being a modern human has suffered from misadventure. Seekers dig out old stuff out of the ground, translate it as best they can. It's old, but none of it lasted. It became another time's debris. And we know what that's like, though the knowing probably won't last. We're making spirit debris with alarming ease and bequeathing it to those to come. Maybe our debris will last. It will certainly outlast us. Words don't last at all, although I resort to them every day to come up with something that could be lasting. The word I'm thinking of now is inherit, as in, can you inherit wisdom? As in, does wisdom last? Inherit, well, that has a legal hue to it now. You need a lawyer to protect you from the laws of inheritance now. You make plans for your stuff, pretending that the stuff will last and that your dominion over it will last. Verily, though, all is vanity in that regard. Forget about it. You designate an heir who will be on the receiving end of all your unlasting directions and all your unlasting stuff. So, that could be marching orders towards the gate that says futility, or abandon hope, all ye who enter here. I'd go with the second one, but not the first one. There's nothing futile in glimpsing the unlastingness of virtually everything that we seem to invest ourselves in. What has this got to do with elderhood? You may recall that I tried to make the point with some vehemence, probably more than once, that elders are not people. They're not personality types. They're not kinds of people. Elders are functions. They're societal functions. They're mandates in search of a culture. And the mandate comes, it seems to me, to this. The principal obligation of an elder is to not last and to be seen to be doing so. In other words, it is one thing to be in the presence of your demise. It is another thing entirely to let the immediate world in on it. And I think the mandate for elderhood is the second one. Elders, it seems to me, have, there's the old cranky old story about they've forgotten so much, they've forgotten more than you know and all that sort of thing. It's not forgetting. No, elders have learned the most, and therefore they know the least. And that's why they travel light. You see, they don't have much to lose, but it's not futility. It's utility. And the great advocacy that elders foment in our midst, or used to, is the ability to be deepened as a consequence of the diminishment that life visits upon you. Hence my analogy of the wine that I must have said at an earlier meeting. If I haven't, very briefly, wine begins with 100 gallons of grape juice, a very unappealing proposition to most of us. And by some alchemy that I don't pretend to understand, you end up with wine at the end of the proposition. Maybe even good wine, maybe immaculate wine. I'm wondering, though, what happens to the 100 gallons? Do you end up with 100 gallons at the finish line? And I'm certain the answer is no. So there's something about the alchemy that's consuming. See, it's distilling and consuming at the same time. And I suspect that's what life would visit upon every would-be elder. That the slings and arrows, and the crises in particular, are there to winnow the saccharine qualities that you are drawn to as a flawed human being. It's important to point this out again, that elders are not less flawed than the rest of us. They are more capable of being flawed than the rest of us. You see, their flaws are now magically have become the cautionary tale for the rest of us. Yeah. And the way they do it is they submit ultimately to the diminishments of life. And the submission has the alchemical consequence of deepening them for us. So their depth is not a personal possession enjoyed by them. It's borne by them, endured by them, if you will. And on their better days, at least, they're capable of sowing it, of distributing it, sometimes wildly, sometimes unknowingly. And at the end of the day, I'm just reminded of this, and perhaps this is the best way to end. And if I've told the story before, forgive me, but I think it stands to reason. And anyway, I turned 67 last week, so I'm allowed to repeat shit. It goes like this. It's a true story, really happened. Thanks for listening, folks. We don't get to do this again. Life's pretty good. If we do get to do this again, life's pretty good. It don't change nothing. It's still a good shake. So I'm thinking I'm making my living carving stone back years. This is 30 odd years or more ago. Oh no, shit, no. Almost 40 years ago. And I'm not making any living at all. But don't forget, I'm married into money, so I don't even know that, you see? I'm naively thinking we're getting by. Oh man, this story doesn't make me look good. But I'm carving away, And I'm realizing there's a difference between making a living and having a way of life. It's something like farming. Farming is no living at all. It's a remarkable way of life, though. It's not a bad choice to make. So somewhere in there, I don't think I ever made it. But I knew that I was coming up against the limits of what I was capable of doing by virtue of being self-taught in this matter of stone carving. I could look at all the books I wanted to and so on. I'm going to find somebody, I thought to myself, and I did. I found this old man. He was in his 80s by then. He wasn't getting old, I should say. He got there already. So he fully qualified as a geezer, right? And he was a cranky ass old Englishman too. So he was, by any standard, he was just old, crusty, unapproachable, unattractive in the extreme. And exactly, it turned out what I needed. So I called him up and I said, yeah, I'm doing what you're doing. I said, and I'm hoping we could just, I could come over and you could tell me the ways of the world, so to speak, and how you made it and all the rest. I mean, I blush to think about what I said, but I did say all that. And finally he responded, he said, same kind of work, huh? Which is his way of telling me, you sure you mean that? I am 60 years older than you. How could we be doing the same anything? But he didn't say any of it. He just said that, same work, huh? And I said, yeah, very uncritically. He said, tell me this. He said, do you work every day? Now I knew what answer he was looking for. I knew the right answer was, yes, I work every day, faithfully. But the accurate answer was no. So I was on the horns of a dilemma and I told the quote truth. And he said, I'll tell you what, you call me back when you work every day. And he hung up the phone. So there I sat, full of my self-esteem and nothing more. And I thought, what an asshole he was. Clearly an asshole because he wasn't corroborating my self-absorption and all of that. So I'm giving you a feel for how an elder functions here. See, even though I've credited him with being really a kind of a crispy son of a bitch, not that compelling. Do you know what I mean? But his function is golden. No? Okay. So what do? Well, I set to work every day. But how long do you do it before you're doing it every day and you qualify for that status? Years? Well, I knew I wasn't going to wait years to call him back. So I think it was 3 weeks. I worked every day for 3 weeks. I called him back and I said, and he said, I know who it is. Not very encouraging. And I said, well, look, I know it's only been 3 weeks. I've worked every day. I know that's not worth much. And I'm going to do that ongoingly, but I'm just hoping that it might be enough to basically to get me in the door. Could you cut me a little slack, more or less? He said, all right, I'll tell you what. He said, we're going to strike a deal right now. And the deal goes like this. You're going to come over. I'm going to tell you where I am. I don't do this very often, but I'm going to tell you. You're going to come over. I'm going to tell you everything I know. My eyes are getting big. Wow. Should I bring a tape recorder? I didn't ask. He said, I'll tell you everything I know. And then he introduced this beautiful caveat. He said, it's probably not going to take as long as you hope it's going to take. So you'll probably be disappointed. But there it is. I'm going to tell you everything I know. And here's the condition. That upon me doing so, through the course of your days, you keep nothing of it to yourself. Because if you do, and I'm dead, I will find you and I will haunt your ass to kingdom come. Quote, that's what he said. I've never forgotten that, clearly. And the fact that I can't keep an eye on the clock and decide when enough already comes, I have to be told. Now you know where it comes from. And my commitment, such as it is, to try to be lucid, at the drop of a hat, comes from that. Because I took him up on his offer, you see. And for better or for worse, so far, he does not seem to have begun to haunt my ass to kingdom come. So for the moment, I'm keeping up my end. And I'm very grateful for the Stoa for enabling me to continue to do so and keep most of my days haunt free.
Beautiful. So I feel very blessed for this series, and on behalf of the Digital Village of the Stoa, sending you deep blessings, my friend, and for this philosophical residency. Do check out A Generation's Worth, the spirit work while the crisis reigns, and we'll close out with a song called Shadow for Dark Roads. Any final words, Stephen, that you'd like to set up the song or close off the series with?
Surely. Yesterday, the band left. We haven't met together in 2 years since the last gig we had in California until Tuesday of this week. And they came up, we played together. We played the material from this record, really for the first time ever, because Gregory and I made the record, just the two of us. And I'm just telling everybody to say, I believe the Nights of Grief and Mystery shall be resurrected. It won't be this year, but we're doing some small shows this year. We're going out west. We're not going to thwart anybody's, legal limits and all the rest. We're going to do some things, crazy things outside and unsustainable things and all of that. And then we'll come back here and do a few shows in Guelph. So if you're around in October and you'd like to see the real thing, you see me not doing this, but somehow doing this to a beat, that'd be something to watch. I'd pay for that. So that's my invitation to you, to keep an eye on the Orphan Wisdom site, and the notifications will come. In the meantime, this is one of the great songs that Gregory, my partner in the project, has come up with. And the twin of this, the other side of the record, the song that you're going to play, is called Beauty Bereft. And it's a meditation on addiction to, what's that stuff called? Fentanyl and OxyContin and all of that. That's, I can't remember the trade name for that stuff, but it's putting these two things together. So when you're hearing the song, think about, in terms of the show that we did, what comes right after it, which is a mournful meditation on the fact that young people are turning to OxyContin as a pain reliever to relieve an undiagnosed pain called the absence of elders in their lives. What did I call it? Beauty in the human form. That's why I call it Beauty Bereft. So this is a song called Shadow, and this is who we could be to each other. I know from a Jungian point of view, the word shadow doesn't carry a lot of upside, but I promise you, it just means where the light ain't got to yet and has no place. So this is Shadow, and thanks for listening, and thanks for playing it.
Takes me away and back again. Oh, the truth intact again. I am a shadow. Ooh.
start off in the light. That's right. And you end in wisdom, if the gods are prevailing. But otherwise, light. So, legions of kids coming downtown from the North American suburbs, and they're looking for a good time. Some of them find it. That's good. Some of them find things they're pretty sure is a good time, and, well, that changes. That's okay. But some of them, more than some, well, they find OxyContin. And more than that find fentanyl. And these are not mood alters per se, down there on the corner. These are not hallucinogens of any kind. These are prescription drugs, friends. And they're right down there, in easy reach. These are pain relievers, you see. They're analgesics. And they are amongst the most pernicious prompters of addiction that this world has ever seen or ever been obliged to bear. And here's the thing, their manufacturers know that. And every day and every night, kids from the most materially prosperous culture that this world has ever produced or been obliged to bear are at considerable risk to themselves, demonstrable risk, this very evening, in this very place, treating themselves for pain, not ennui, not depression, not despair, not purposelessness, pain, a kind of pain that it seems no anesthesiologist would treat or countenance or even recognize. And the manufacturers, they know that too. And then if you would, consider this word anesthetic. Who knew that the word that we use to describe numbing ourselves for the sake of getting by has our word for beauty buried there in its midst? Aesthetic, pertaining to beauty, the ability to make beauty, or to know beauty, or to have it in your life, which is an ability, or to be that in someone else's life, also an ability. And you reassemble the word, and what does it mean to be anesthetized? The word is telling you plainly, it means to be disabled where beauty is concerned. To be unable to make beauty and to know beauty and to have it in your life or to be it in someone else's. Grief or mystery? Let's see. I ask you this, who treats themselves for beauty? That's too easy. It's the beauty bereft. That's who. These kids are not down on the corner looking for beauty in their lives. I dare say they've given up on beauty more or less entirely by the time they're down there, scooping up that fentanyl. They've given up on beauty by then, and they've lived its absence long enough. They are awash, are they not? In the new and the improved and the version 12.6 of every godless trinket and device. And many of them, maybe more than many, they can't bear it anymore. They've been obliged to proceed in their young lives minus the presence of ratifying human agedness, which is the beauty they're treating themselves for. Ratifying human agedness. Elders, in other words. And what's become of them? They're 25-year-olds now,
competition with 55-year-olds for the same music, the same clothes, and the same boyfriend, the same girlfriend at the same time, the same payday, the same spiritual charge at the same retreat center. And many of them can't take the competition anymore. They're bereft of elders, and you know now what their solution is. Disable that part of them that longs after that ratifying human agedness. Beauty in the human form. Oh, they've tried swearing off the stuff, the time-sanctioned, the time-honored kind. But the longing after real human beauty is too strong. And it's involuntary too. And it does not answer to our sorrow or our command to have it otherwise. The longing for aged beauty is a powerful thing, and it's not going away. So, anesthetized instead. It takes powerful medicine indeed to get by without it, and to make as if it doesn't matter anymore. So here's the thing. Legions of kids down on the corner, awash and adrift in what's gone and what's missing in their lives. And they are spiritually and psychically free for the taking down there. And hasn't it come to pass in our own lifetime that the young among us can't tell the difference between being useful in a troubled time and being used by the troubles of the time?